Hello, and welcome back to Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife. Today I will read Part 1, Chapter 2. It had been a heady 2 months' engagement. Indeed, with two promised daughters in close company with their betrotheds, one might have expected Mrs. Bennet to have been beside herself with vigilance of chastity. But she was not. The exceedingly advantageous marriages were set. The only insult that she imagined could now befall them was for either of the intended bridegrooms to drop dead before the wedding. Hence, when both couples had sought the outdoors, and therefore separate paths for some time alone, her primary concern was that neither of the gentlemen in question caught cold. Notwithstanding their mother's peculiar inattention to virginal honor, Jane and Elizabeth Bennet endeavored to comport themselves during their periods of betrothal with a politesse so precise as to demand society overlook their sister Lydia's decidedly divergent road to matrimony. She really likes alliteration. I mean, I do too, but this is kind of overboard. Entering into this delicate balance of love and propriety, however, obtruded the very weighty matter of immoderately aroused libido. The entire quandary might have been circumvented had Elizabeth not allowed, welcomed, invited, summoned, a kiss from Mr. Darcy, for a union that had not been christened by greater affection than the holding of a gloved hand that was a moment of considerable excitation. I love how she added different adjectives in parentheses of Elizabeth kissing Darcy. That's an interesting way to go about it. Oh well. First, one must understand that the distance between Mr. Bingley's estate of Netherfield and the Bennets' house of Longbourn was traversed with the regularity and certainty of the sunrise in the short months of the Bennet sisters' engagements. Upon fine days, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley travelled the 3 miles upon horseback. Upon foul they came by coach. Upon fair days, Bingley and Jane, followed by Elizabeth and Darcy at a discreet distance, walked out to stroll. It was upon one of these perambulations that this kissing business was initiated. Kissing business? And thereupon temporarily terminated. For Miss Bennet's and Mr. Darcy's tender moment came coincident to an extended rainstorm. Hence, all subsequent visits with Elizabeth's intended were relegated to Longbourn House in the company of assorted sisters, parents, and servants. Mrs. Bennet might turn a blind eye to affection betwixt them, but it was quite unlikely that all would. This was a considerable vexation, in that after that first kiss, Elizabeth thought of little except the anticipation of the next. That interim was appropriated by a second hazard. The first, being housebound by reason of inclement weather, was quite beyond anyone's control. The second no less so, for when she received the letter from Elizabeth advising her of the impending marriages, Lydia Bennet Wickham did not offer her nuptial congratulations by post. She came herself. Dun dun dun! Lydia had written to her mother to expect her, but such was her haste, she arrived only hours behind her missive. Regrettably, the Wickhams' marital bliss had lasted little longer than it took the rector to pronounce them husband and wife. Howbeit, in the excitement of parading about as Mrs. Wickham, Lydia did not detect this for several months. Indeed, understanding the youngest Bennet sister's nature, shallow, fickle, and dim, it would not be unreasonable to assume that had the Wickhams remained in London, the abundance of shops there might have kept her insensible of it for years. But in the gloom of Newcastle, household felicity was not abundant, and, not introspective by nature, Lydia was unable to enjoy the single thing Newcastle did offer in abundance, besides coal, that of quiet, if sooty, solitude. Reading bored her, sewing was a chore, and walks were, to Lydia, only a means to cover the ground between where she was and where she wanted to be. Activity lay by way of engagement balls and wedding breakfasts, citing her extreme affection for her sisters, dubious, and homesickness for Longbourn, unquestionable. She applied to her husband to return home. Lydia 200 miles away? Happy thought for Wickham. Yes, dearest Lydia, you must be with your sisters. I am not certain my heart will bear your absence. Do not tarry longer than you must, and then hurry home to me. Lydia thought she might well tarry as long as possible, for while being ensconced in North England may initially have been regarded as an adventure, its allure waned more precipitously than did her husband's. The shops were sparse, her friends were even fewer. Those she had soon wearied of hearing how she, the youngest of 5 sisters, had usurped the title of ranking daughter by becoming the first wed. Her own consideration of that coup paled when she read the letter telling of the engagements of both Jane and Elizabeth, for she had only bested them by 6 months. And even in the infinitesimal area of her intellect that Lydia reserved for contemplation, it occurred to her that the proposals Elizabeth and Jane had secured eclipsed hers considerably. Although she knew Wickham more handsome by half than either Mr. Bingley or Mr. Darcy, and certainly more charming. Well, Mr. Bingley was amicable, but Mr. Darcy was absolutely dour. The few months of her marriage made her understand one great profundity. Beauty and allurement were not the only attributes of importance when selecting a husband. Money was paramount to both. Of course, money is the top priority of someone looking for a husband to be with for the rest of their lives. Yeah. But Lydia's consideration was specific to legal tender, not title or position. Some amongst the gentry would suffer any indignity to maintain or obtain position. That alone meant nothing to Lydia. Even she knew title and money were not necessarily synonymous in the vast country estates. Some baronial and ducal homes were in debt up to their leaking roofs. One of her few good qualities was that she was not a social snob. She loved money, true, but her adoration was burst by the misfortune of her being a spendthrift. Her purse was always in need of replenishing. She desired the exactitude of money, not the encumbrance of wealth. Hence, a man of position and wealth, who could actually produce currency, was to Lydia truly a prize. Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, who both had those exceedingly advantageous attributes in abundance and were happily in the additional circumstance of available cash, were to Lydia as much a matrimonial trophy as had their heads been mounted upon the wall. It came to pass that Providence had seen to it that Lydia's dowry of £50 per annum and Wickham's paltry army pay did not completely embrace Lydia's wants nor Wickham's gambling debts. In the light of that injustice, and as it had long been her position that charity did indeed begin at home, Lydia saw no reason why all the Bennet sisters' good fortune should not be communal. Upholding a second strongly clutched belief that the end always justifies the means, Lydia realized it might be necessary to subdue her sisters' possible reluctance to share in their future husband's plethora of funds. Thus she strove to become not only their dear youngest sister, but their confidant and teacher as well. I didn't think she only got £50 per year. I thought it was a little bit more than that, but I could be mistaken. For if the loss of her brief status of first daughter was imminent by reason of new marriages, she still clung to the single feat she held over her Virgo and Actus sisters. She alone, what would befall Jane and Elizabeth upon their wedding night, she alone was in the position to explain it all to them. Explain it all as in italics. Their mother would not. Mrs. Bennet's only advice to Lydia had been, this was not prior to their actual carnal union, but she advised it all the same, bear up, Lydia, and be brave. Suffer as you must, and make certain your husband knows it. Yeah, okay. I'm pretty sure sex is supposed to be enjoyable. Copulation as recreation would have bum-fuzzled Mrs. Bennet, for although her mother thought of Lydia as the daughter most truly after her own heart, she did not share Lydia's concupiscence. Lydia knew that her mother had to have consummated relations with their father, but was it not for the undeniable existence of herself and 4 sisters, she would have argued that possibility to death. Lydia sought a Morris Congress just as studiously as her mother avoided it. In whatever were Wickham's drawbacks as a provider, he was a prolific and masterful lover. Interesting. As it happened, Lydia knew this as fact because he told her so emphatically and often. Yes, you should always believe a guy when he tells you he's really good at sex. There were, however, not as many opportunities for Lydia to admire her husband's self-professed masculine achievements by the 6th month of their marriage. Had the appellation of wife not elated Lydia so, she might have noted that Mrs. Lydia Wickham's nether regions were not sacrificed to Venus by Major George Wickham 1/10 as often as when she was Miss Lydia Bennet. So that means she had 10 times more sex with Wickham before she was married. That's a lot of sex before she was married. They weren't engaged or together for very long before they got married, as far as I know. So that's a lot of sex. That was regrettable, but had to be forgiven, for even Lydia knew that Major Wickham was so fatigued by his exceedingly weighty and tedious assigned duty of telling the sergeant major what to do, that come the evening he could scarcely pull off his own boots. Exhausted or not, Lydia had some success at cajoling him into accommodating her, but she soon learnt there are only so many bodily orifices to penetrate, and without the enthusiasm of her poor weary husband, her gratification was limited. Longbourn would be a merry distraction from drab Tyne and Ware, and as Lydia gradually discovered as the miles grew between her coach and Wickham, distance does invariably soften one's matrimonial travails. So by the time Lydia reached Hertfordshire, the memory of her husband's libido had been resurrected to premarital prominence. Hence, she was quite anxious to share with Jane and Elizabeth the fortune that was soon to befall them, even if it had to ensue that lesser lovers than her Wickham. With as much ado, bedlam, and brouhaha. Yes, she says brouhaha. It's spelled B-R-O-U. Ha-ha. Yep. So, with as much ado, bedlam, and brouhaha as she could incite, Lydia arrived by hackney coach into her mother's outstretched arms. She kissed the air in her father's direction, then bypassed Elizabeth, Jane, Kitty, and Mary altogether to offer her heartfelt and prodigious congratulations to her future brothers-in-law. Lydia arrived at 4 in the afternoon. By 5 they had supped, and 15 minutes after 6 o'clock the men retired to Mr. Bennet's library to enjoy a decanter of port. The Miss Bennets and their mother anticipated conversation with Mrs. Wickham in the west parlour. She, however, had urgent business to attend to with Elizabeth and Jane. With whispered entreaty she herded them into the first available bedroom. Once there, Jane sat upon the side of the bed in apprehension. Elizabeth chose to stand with arms folded, her posture reflecting a complete understanding that all this urgency was undoubtedly in preparation for the disclosure of another of Lydia's schemes. Her premonition was not unrewarded, for Lydia closed the door, and without taking her hand from the knob, turned. Thereupon she issued a tremendous, if melodramatic, sigh. She went to both sisters, took one hand in each of hers, and clasped them to her bosom. Oh, to be a naive young girl again, Lydia, the wise matron of 16, gushed to the 22-year-old Jane. You know nothing of men and their carnal cravings, do you, my dear, sweet, innocent sister? Jane, of course, did not, but all three knew if Lydia wanted to disconcert someone with graphic delineation, Jane would be the victim of choice. Watching the manipulative Lydia homing in upon Jane as if singling out a lamb for slaughter did not sit well with Elizabeth. Lydia, however, was so enthralled to be in a position of authority that she did not see Elizabeth glaring at her. Jane's wide-eyed, wary look invited Lydia to expand. There are things you must know, Jane, Lizzie. She looked over at Elizabeth, whose countenance bore the distinct expression of one who knew herself far more ignorant than she would have liked. It also beheld a pronounced distaste for being enlightened by a younger sister, particularly Lydia, the unparalleled queen of theatrics. As if reading her mind, Lydia said, "If you believe our mother will advise you, Lizzie, do not be so foolhardy." She then repeated what Mrs. Bennet had told her about the wedding bed, punctuating it with a merry laugh. Noting a complete lack of sisterly camaraderie upon the subject of their mother's marital shortcomings, she hastily prattled on. "Indubitably, you believe Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy are complete gentlemen. Surely it is thus that they strive to be. But they are men, and beneath their chivalrous manners lurk barely tethered desires of the flesh. More than one Sunday the vicar had warned of carnal pleasure, hence it was understandable for at least Jane to be alarmed. However, if Jane was held in fright, Elizabeth was not. Her disdain for Lydia's pompousness was compromised somewhat by curiosity. Intelligence available to young ladies upon the subject was intentionally meagre. Decorum in society demanded benignness. Yet Elizabeth managed to respond mildly. "How kind of you, Lydia, to have come all this distance to warn us of carnal cravings of the unwed." Not completely oblivious to the mockery from the heatiness of her singular position of matrimony, Lydia replied, "Of course not, Lizzie, but you would do well to listen to my admonishments, lest you take unawares by Mr. Darcy's conjugal embrace." "Pray?" Elizabeth's reluctant interest at hand, Lydia returned to the sanctuary of Jane's more genuine one and came directly to the point. "When you give yourself for the first time, you must be prepared. For, are you not, when the lover takes you, the pain will be unbearable." Believing Lydia's superior practice in this had to be accepted, Jane's eyes widened even more. Physical pain for anyone was the very thing which Jane held in greatest repugnance. "Lydia," Jane said, "do you think it best to talk so unguardedly? Is this not private?" "Yes," Lydia agreed undaunted. "I am speaking to you both privately, am I not?" Of course, the only way Lydia knew to speak was without caution. Privacy was hardly a hindrance upon her either. Hence, Lydia continued unrestrained. "It will be glorious beyond words, but you may cry out to God to take your life." "Lydia, really?" "'Tis true, Lizzie." Lydia turned to Elizabeth, lifting her chin defensively. "You know nothing of this, one must assume." No, she did not. It was a quandary, for she was very keen to hear the details that were kept so scrupulously from the ears of maidens. However, she did not want to lend encouragement to Lydia, whom she knew needed little, nor to have Jane terrorized by her hyperbole. It was clear Lydia's impending effect, if not intent, for Lydia returned her attention to her eldest sister, whose face had lost all color. "Your husband's manly instrument will swell big and red and hard and angry and enormous." What? Let's just read that again. "Your husband's manly instrument will swell big and red and hard and angry and enormous." That's a lot of adjectives. Here Lydia struggled for adjectives, and having accidentally lapsed into repetition, strove on, and when he first puts it up in your nani, yes, that's what she's calling her vagina, apparently, nani, "it will be with such force as to render you prostrate with ecstasy and pain." She lowered her voice in a highly conspiratable whisper, and said, "Once he thrusts into you, he will again, and again, and again." Lydia had to take a swallow, in fortune, for with each successive again, Jane's eyes widened and she leaned farther away from Lydia, and by the third again was almost prone upon the bed. Lydia concluded with a deep sigh, "It is a sweaty prospect, and his spendings are sticky, and his Larry-doodle does go limp with great dispatch after he has had his way with you." Lydia had frowned at the thought of these drawbacks, but perked up, remembering, "But if he can just stay with it, he will bring you such rapture that you will sing about it for days." Jane and Elizabeth were silent. I would probably be silent too. I don't think I would be able to react to that. That's just, yeah. Thus Lydia supposed it was of a stunned nature due to her oratory, added, "Of course, this is the lover that Wickham is. You, sisters, may not be so fortunate as I, for my husband is endowed with an organ of far grander proportions than any other man." Lydia leaned forward conspiratorially again. "And this is what is most pleasing to his lover." Elizabeth narrowed her eyes and asked Lydia how she found validation of this information. "Why, Wickham told me," she replied without a hint of question. Elizabeth was not in a position to know whether George Wickham's apparatus was indeed superior to any other man's, but to her the very fact that vaporing cock-a-hoop boasted of something automatically called its veracity into question. Looking at the skepticism written on Elizabeth's face, Lydia hurried to assure her. You cannot imagine anything so frightening as the sight of Wickham's excited member. I am sure I do not want to imagine Mr. Wickham's excited anything. Me too, Lizzie. Me too. You will see a great deal far sooner than you might anticipate, Lizzie, if you are not cautious with your affection before you wed. Lydia held up her fingernails and inspected them diligently as she said, for a man's ardor does not await the wedding vows. Of this Lydia knew well, and Elizabeth only raised her eyebrow in reminder. Lydia saw the look and snapped, Do not eye me so severely, Lizzie. If Mr. Darcy is half the man as Wickham, his flag will fly quite readily at the smallest provocation, I assure you. You do not mean, Lydia, Jane interjected, that a gentleman is quite without his own will in such a situation? I mean, retorted Lydia, that if you allow Mr. Bingley to kiss you too ardently, he will be aroused to such lust his loins will ache, and his engorged lance will burst from his nether garments to ravish you. Wickham's waggled at me more than once. What? Lydia! Lydia replied self-righteously, I have no say in the nature of men. I am merely the bearer of the information. If you do not choose to believe what is a verifiable truth, 'tis your folly, not mine. And with the timing of a true thespian, she rose and quitted the room. Jane sat upon the bed in a befuddled stupor. Elizabeth knew her dear sister's sensibilities had been abused far beyond the immediate reclamation. Was she not so curious her own might have found insult too? But this time the usual annoyance Lydia incited in Elizabeth was compounded by being at the mercy of her own ignorance. Even with no brothers to have enlightened them, Elizabeth was marginally informed upon nature's intent. She had seen boys, of course, at least boy babies, and she held some notion of the rather flagrant configuration of the male of the species. She was uncertain why she held Darcy's person in such interest, but until Lydia had importuned them, she had not taken the time to study the matter. Elizabeth endeavored to think of something soothing to say to Jane, but with her own mouth agape as it was, Jane was rising to leave before she could. Jane patted her hair distractedly and murmured about something that needed her attention. However, she stopped at the door, her hand upon the knob, and stood a moment deep in thought. Thereupon she turned and bid Elizabeth, Pray, Lizzie, there is something I do not understand. Yes, Jane? If it is so painful to his wife for a husband to do his duty, why would she want him to be large? A perfectly good question. So yeah, that was the end of chapter 2. Sorry it was so long. I don't really understand the book so far because it's like the first chapter is after the honeymoon and then we skip to the months leading up to the wedding. And I'm not really seeing the connection. It's kind of annoying. I was confused the first time I read it. So yeah, see you tomorrow.